Good morning. I am Josh. I'm with the Idaho Renaissance Fair. We're going to be discussing a little bit of sword history today. First, to begin with, actual usable swords are made from high carbon steel, so anytime you're handling blades or weaponry, you want to wear gloves. The oils in your hands can actually mar and etch the steel, so you want to put on our gloves. Safety first. We're going to start primarily, we're going to stay in European swords, but we're going to start earlier back with one of the more recognizable swords. A lot of people will be carrying these around at Renaissance fairs, selling them at Renaissance fairs. This is a Roman style gladius. It is thinner at the base here, opens up in a leaf edge. It is double-edged, a leaf shape. It is a double-edged sword. The gladius was used tactically in the Roman testudo formations. What they would do is the legionnaires would have their tower shields, and they would form up in the front with tower shields in front of them, and then the rows behind them would put the tower shields above them, forming a turtle, which is what the word testudo is derived from, is the Roman word for turtle. And so then behind these tower shields, they would advance and then stab, and advance and then stab. And so occasionally they'd get a slash in, but the short length was really, really prime for advancing and stabbing. Additionally, they would use the spike that was on the front of their tower shield to pin someone to the ground and stab them. So that is what the gladius was originally for. It's what it was designed around, and that was kind of its tactical advantage. It was used really well with those testudo formations. The next level of sword up, I don't have an example of. It's called the spatha. It was really, really similar. It was longer. It had a lot more slashing and swinging abilities. It was used by Roman commanders as time went on and things needed to evolve and change. Roman commanders usually weren't in the formation, and so they were a bit more open. They needed a bit more reach. Another very similar sword to the gladius is the Viking sword. What most people think of when they think of Vikings is that sword that they're swinging around like crazy. It was probably another 6 inches to a foot longer than the gladius, so it would be out here. It was still a one-handed sword because they were using it with their shields, but its advantage was it was similar to the spatha in evolution of purpose. But what they would do is the Vikings would have their shield wall, but once they engaged in combat, the shield wall would often crumble, and so the Vikings would then have a sword that they could hack and slash and attack with in that manner. So these are probably some of the most common swords that you see in movies and things like that, and that is their general history. The next step up we were supposed to have, but due to vehicle issues we couldn't get over here, is the long sword. It's the other one that you see very often in movies. You see it in King Arthur shows and in knights movies and things like that. It's the one that they usually want to use holding with two hands. It can go anywhere from a hand and a half, which means you can use it one-handed or two-handed, all the way up to a full two-handed sword. They are often confused, or Hollywood is often confused and calls these broadswords or claymores. Neither is necessarily accurate. They were two-handed swords. They were used in the field in open battles, in open battlefields. Not a whole lot of formations were built around the longsword because they had to swing. You can't really do that in formation. But really good examples of this, like I said, would be some of the King Arthur movies, the Robin Hood movies, things like that. Even Aragorn. Aragorn uses a hand and a half sword. In the Lord of the Rings movies, the movie Aragorn, at the very end, you see the guy and he pulls up the blade and he cuts down the banner. That is a long sword that he's using. The reason why the longsword often gets confused with a broadsword or a claymore, and we'll start with the broadsword. The broadsword, and I'm actually going to use this one. This is a type of broadsword. It's called a mortuary sword, and it has a beginnings of a basket hilt. Broadswords were known most for their basket hilts. It was a one-handed blade. It was used for swinging, but it had a very broad blade that was double-edged on both sides, right? Double-edged broadsword. And you had the mortuary sword and the basket hilt swords. That's the broadsword family. The claymore is actually in two different types of families, and this is something I actually wanted to discuss a little bit. The claymore is kind of a misnomer. A lot of people get it wrong and weird because it covers a few different styles of sword. The two most common styles of sword that are referred to as claymores are basket-hilted swords and two-handed longswords. The reason for this is because claymore is actually a derivative of the Scottish Gaelic terminology for swords in general. The basket-hilt swords are the closest to claymore in sound in what they actually are. It is the Claymore, is their word for a basket-hilted sword. And that's just a broadsword. A lot of times, if you're watching Outlander or some of the more period-appropriate Scottish movies, you'll see the nobles will have a basket-hilted sword, and it's got the cloth wrapped through the basket. That is a claymore. That's a broadsword, but it is a claymore, specifically a Claymore. The other one that you always see that always gets mixed up is the super tall two-handed long swords that people say this is a Scottish claymore. It's actually not. It is a two-handed long sword. The Scottish word for those was a claive de lave, and that is again, claive de lave. That's their terminology for one of the longer two-handed swords, a longsword. So there's a difference in swords there, but claymore is more of a general term for any sword that is Scottish in origin, and it can cover the long swords, the broadswords. It can also cover Viking swords. There's a term for something similar to the Viking swords. There's a term for smaller bastard swords. There's a term for all kinds of different types of swords but they all start with that claive and usually end with more. Basically, it just means giant cleaver. So that's where claymore comes from. It covers a large family of swords, but it's usually the ones that were Scottish in origin. Going back to basket-hilted swords, the evolution of basket-hilted swords included the backsword. This one is an English backsword. You can tell because it is a flat back until you get to about this point here on the blade, where it becomes a sharpened edge. The sharpened edge allows for piercing, but the backswords were adapted from the broadsword to be more of a horseback riding sword at first. So as you're riding your horse, you can wield it one-handed and you can slash down at your opponents. Later, they were adapted for further use on ships, and so you see cutlasses and things like that as a version of the backsword. Also in the backsword family, you have the scimitar and the falchion and things like that as well. So that is the backsword. Now, going back in time just a little bit further, there was an evolution of swords where they decided they didn't want power, right? Slashing. They didn't want their fighting to be so much for war. They wanted fighting to be more for duels. The Italians decided that what they would do is they would come up with a long blade where only the very tip was sharp. They named it the rapier. It was often used with a dagger. I don't have my gouge, that's the term for a secondary weapon in fencing. I don't have my gouge on me, but the rapier was often used with a dagger, and they would fight, but it was close quarters. External combatants weren't involved, and so it was one-on-one, and so they had their fencing styles and their swords would actually mimic that concept of a one-on-one fight. The rapier was very much the start of gentlemen's duels, things of that nature. There were three basic types of rapier. The Italians, who focused on stabbing practices more. It was very much, there were an offensive blade, and their focus was stabbing. It was forward and backward movements, easy footwork. Some of the schools of fight that are very prominent in that you see mentioned in movies and things are things like the Agrippa fighting stance. That is based off of Italian fencing. The Spanish swords, the Spanish rapiers, which I don't have any on this table here, the Spanish rapiers were shorter, had more of a slashing-esque weapon. They would often slash a little bit more. The Spanish rapiers were evolved that way because they did need to be used in combat as well. Spain was in the middle of wars at the same time that everybody else was in the middle of the Renaissance. So Spain was involved in the Renaissance too, but Spain was involved in wars during that same time period. They were fighting against the Moors who were trying to take over Spain. That was a very long campaign. They were involved in fights trying to take over France and Italy and things like that. But they were the ones who were most frequently in need of a weapon that could both be used in a gentlemanly duel and on the battlefield. And so their weapons were a bit more robust, they were shorter, and it reflected in their fighting styles as well. The French are the other ones that really brought the rapier in. The French had, again, similar to the Italians, a longer sword, but the French fighting style was based more in defensive. So where the Italians were very much an offensive fighting style, the French focused on being able to disengage. It was still extremely effective for duels. It was still very, very much a widely used form. And it eventually is what evolved into the fencing that we know today with the really, really thin foils. But that is kind of the difference between those swords. As time went on, the saber became much more effective until modern weaponry came along, until firearms became more prevalent. In military history, sword-wise, sabers became the swords of your commanders and your cavalrymen and things like that. And it was just a curved version, not a great curve like the falchion, but a more curved version of a backsword. It was extremely effective in combat, in military combat. And so it actually, most of what you see as decorative on military uniforms nowadays, on officers' uniforms, they will often have a sword involved there. That sword is a saber. So that's kind of the history of these, of swords itself. There are a lot of other weaponry that was used throughout the early ages of warfare. Swords were by no means the most superior form of weaponry, but we can get into pole arms at another date. So that is all for today. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it was very instructive. I also hope that your history is as fun as our history. And until next time, huzzah!